Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second in the series of the Feminist Futures, the Feminist Past series. My name is Kristen Smith, and I am the director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Chanda Weinstein-Prescott and our discussion with Josh Rebke with her about her newest book, The Disordered Cosmos. But before I get into that introduction, I want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating. This is an event that is in collaboration with the College of Natural Sciences here at the University of Texas, and we are so elated to be able to have this unprecedented interdisciplinary conversation and collaboration between the College of Liberal Arts and the College of Natural Sciences. And so without further ado, I want to pass things over to Dean Vandenbout for him to bring us remarks.
Thank you, Kristen. And a special thanks to everyone at the Center for Women's and Gender Studies in the College of Liberal Arts and in the Natural Sciences who helped organize today's author event and discussion. In Natural Sciences, this event coincides with some conversations our community has been having about the overlap between our scientific disciplines and people's experiences with science. We aim to be a community of belonging and support for every talented student and emerging scientist, and we understand that fostering belonging takes work. I've spent a bit of time among scientists and mathematicians, and I can say that sometimes some of us are more comfortable engaging with our data and experiments than we are engaging with people's personal stories and experiences. As scientists and STEM majors, we love our subject areas, and we can get caught up in the scientific method, and we forget that our passions for what we study, whether it's stars or cells or computer bits, happens within the context of working with others and relating to the experiences of others. Then we're missing something important. The truth is that many of us have a lot more practice talking about the worldwide community of scientists and mathematicians, or about how the scientific method is standardized and the neutrality of science, than we do talking about the fact that there are systems and structures in place in our disciplines that have a history of exclusion. Our college wants to make more room for those conversations as well, even if they can be difficult at times. These are the conversations we need to have if we aim to move forward together. So as UT alum Brene Brown says, when we deny the story, it defines us, but when we own the story, we can write a brave new ending. So listening to the authentic stories and experiences of women and people of color and gender and sexual minorities in science, I and all of us get to take one step closer to where we want and need to be, which is understanding. And also a place where all the talented people from diverse backgrounds who happen to love stars and cells and computer bits can find a community of belonging in math and science. So in natural sciences, we want this to just be the first of many opportunities for folks in the college with friends from across the university and across our disciplines to come together and have discussions like the one happening today. We're not alone in this. As the Vice Provost for Diversity today started a series of town halls about projects on campus related to providing more context around the past wrongs at the university and where we hope to be together moving forward. Events like these are important as we work to build a new foundation at UT in science that is inclusive, equitable, and welcoming for everyone. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, as well as to our future ones, about where science and scientists can learn from our history, including the personal histories and of individuals and the collective histories of communities. And now I'll turn things over to Dean Ann Stevens from the College of Liberal Arts.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming today, and thank you, David. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from today's guest, who has really done incredible things to advance science, but also to make science accessible to everyone, to make it accessible, to make it meaningful, and to really make it empowering. in the College of Natural Sciences, as well as here in the College of Liberal Arts, we want our students to be able to go out into the world with knowledge and skills, be able to think critically, and to really tackle problems from multiple perspectives: social, humanistic, ethical, and scientific and technological. And that's why today's event is especially meaningful. And I'm so happy to be partnering with the Center for Women and Gender Studies and the College of Natural Sciences. I think the past year, if you weren't already convinced, the past year has given us plenty of examples of both scientific and humanistic challenges and solutions, and also almost daily shows us how interrelated they are. Today's guest is really perfect to bring this perspective of being a leading astrophysicist and someone who has worked to improve the human element of how we make progress in education and in science. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this. I now will turn things back to our moderators after a brief introduction of the moderators. Joshua Robke is an assistant professor of practice in the College of Natural Sciences. He's a science historian who teaches courses on the literature of science and science writing to honor students, and is currently working on a social and cultural history of particle physics titled The Invisible World. In addition, you've already heard a bit from Dr. Kristen Smith, who directs the Center for Women and Gender Studies and is an associate professor of African and African diaspora studies and anthropology. Her work focuses primarily on transnational anti-Black police violence, Black liberation struggles, and the paradox of Black citizenship in the Americas, especially in Brazil and the United States. With that, I will move us along and turn things back to Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Dean Stevens and Dean Vanderbilt. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the collaboration with this project. And indeed, to echo your remarks, it's very, very important. And we're just so excited. Before we get started with the more formal part of the afternoon, something that we always do here at the University of Texas is do our land acknowledgement, which we find extremely important, that was organized by the Native American and Indigenous Studies program here at the University of Texas. And so I will read that now. We would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama Coxuata, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan-Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce our illustrious guest. I am extremely excited that we have Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein here with us today. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Prescott-Weinstein earlier, or the end of last year, actually, when we did a podcast together. And so this is just a rare treat to be able to have her back in conversation and to also engage the rest of the University of Texas campus in her magnificent work. Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is also a columnist for New Scientist and Physics World. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and dark matter. She also does research in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. Nature recognized her as one of 10 people who shaped science in 2020, and Essence magazine has recognized her as one of 15 Black women who are paving the way in STEM and breaking barriers. A co-founder of Particles for Justice, she received the 2017 LGBT+ Physicists Acknowledgement of Excellence Award for her contributions to improving conditions for marginalized people in physics, and the 2021 American Physical Society Edward A. Boucher Award for her contributions to particle cosmology. Originally from East LA, she divides her time between the New Hampshire seacoast and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her first book, The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred, was released on March 9th, 2021 from Bold Type Books. Thank you so much, Chanda, for being here. We are excited to have you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone involved in making this event happen, particularly Kristen. I know you put a lot of work into it, but I know that there were a lot of folks involved. So thank you to everyone whose names I don't know, and to the deans for the nice introductions. So I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. I'm giddy. I'm in my fangirl mode. I'm not gonna lie. And so I'm really excited to have you here. I'm gonna pass it over to Josh because Josh is gonna introduce the way that we're going to conduct our conversation today. So Josh.
Well, first of all, thank you, Deans. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you so much, Chanda, for being here. It's really nice to meet you for the very first time. I'm honored to share a screen with these two amazing scholars. What we're going to do is we're going to be running this a little bit like inside the actor's studio. Some of you may be too young to know what that is. But basically, we're going to be asking some questions that we came up with beforehand, hopefully to elicit deeper understanding of who Chanda is and what her work is. So I guess maybe I should sort of start with my first question, so we can go. So we know your bona fides. We know your multiform talents. We've heard your bio, but I want to start sort of at the end of your book, and you have this lovely letter to your mother, Margaret Prescott, and you say that you cannot keep all of your worlds separate, and you have a lot of worlds that you talk about, and that you cannot live as multiple people. So I wanted to ask, or I guess I was hoping you would tell us, just like actor studio style, like, who is Chanda Prescott Weinstein?
Oh man, I think I was like ready to go until you got to the very end of it. I was definitely ready to talk about my mom. So I guess, in context of that, I'll start by saying that I'm a daughter, and it's also, people may have caught in the biography that Kristen read, that I made a point of ensuring that my origins in East Los Angeles, East Los as it's known to some, it was an important formative geography for me. So I think that my mom's from Barbados, and even though she spent most of her life in the United States, she came to the US when she was 12. She still thinks of herself as like an island village girl. And I think in that same way, even though it's been a really long time since I lived in East LA, because I left for college like a week after my 17th birthday, I'm still very much a person of and by East Los Angeles. So that's one way of thinking about me. I guess the other way that I tend to introduce myself is that I'm a dark matter expert. I would say that's the problem that drives my research right now. I'm a professor, so that means that actually a lot of my research time, I'm putting this in air quotes, is managing members of my research group, getting their research done, and answering emails and all of the things. So I'm also a part-time research administrator, I guess, is another way of thinking about what we do as faculty, is facilitate other people's research and make some contributions of our own as well. And I think of myself as a writer and a thinker. I know sometimes people give me the label of activist and organizer, but because my parents are both organizers and I understand the physicality of that labor and the commitment of that labor, I think I'm very hesitant to take that label for myself. Although I will certainly say that sometimes I'm an agitator. So in my writing and thinking, I agitate for change. And I do think that's a contribution to organizing. It's not my full-time job. And then just to return to the science thing, I will admit that probably the problem that bugs me the most is not actually dark matter, but actually cosmic acceleration. I was actually running late to show up on the Zoom for this because I was explaining to my spouse all of my different all of the things about cosmic acceleration that bother me. So maybe I'll stop there.
I think that, that just piques my interest. I kind of want to ask you about that, because what is it about? Tell me what it is again, because so I'm the humanist on the panel, and so I'm going to be the one that asks the very, very basic questions about science. So tell me about the concept that you said is what excites you the most. I just want to know a little bit about it.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by saying I'm not sure excited is the right word. More like if I start thinking about it, I might not go to sleep because I get like just really stressed out and in my head about it. So just to situate it in context, so it's been known for almost 100 years. Well, we're actually this decade going to be celebrating the 100-year anniversary of us coming to the understanding that space-time is expanding, that the universe is expanding. And the spring before I applied to college, it was announced that 2 different teams had discovered that the expansion is accelerating. So for people who are not physicists in the audience, if you think about, you're trying to get on the freeway, you get on the on-ramp and you start to pick up speed, you're hitting the gas, your car is accelerating because you're changing speed. So in some sense, space-time is doing the same thing, it's accelerating. So this phenomenon is called cosmic acceleration. And it's actually the thing I ended up writing my PhD dissertation about. So my dissertation title was Cosmic Acceleration as Quantum Gravity Phenomenology. So I don't want people to worry too much about like all of the words there. But just to say that it's a problem that I found compelling. And because it happened, because it was announced the spring before I applied to college, it was actually the thing that I was thinking about. So I think I wrote about it in my college applications. I know for my application to Caltech, and this is for the students are going to be like, whoa, we applied on paper and Caltech had a spot on the application where you could like glue or draw or whatever, put anything that you wanted. And I cut out part of a Scientific American article about cosmic acceleration and glued it into that space and said, I want to solve this problem. So what's the problem? So we know there's this phenomenon happening, and it turns out that we don't have a good explanation for why. There's almost certainly some physicist in the audience who's like, she's wrong, we've solved the problem. So I'll just point out, there isn't necessarily consensus. I think the solution that some people have settled for is a form of settling, and I find it very unsatisfying scientifically. In my view, it points to a disconnect between our understanding of the vacuum, so emptiness and empty space-time, a disconnect between that concept and Einstein's relativity and in quantum field theory, which is the framework we use to understand particle physics. They just give you 2 very different visions, and there's a numerical mismatch between the measured value of what we now call dark energy. I have beef with that, I'll just say. And the vacuum energy that we would expect to get from particle physics. So this is what's interesting about this. I promise I'm going to stop in a moment. But
I am really loving this. So just so we're clear, this is amazing. Keep going.
The interesting thing about this problem is that this is connected to something called the cosmological constant, which people were already worried about. I would actually say like the most beautiful like classic paper on this is actually UT Austin faculty member Steve Weinberg's 1989 paper on the cosmological constant, where he basically said there should be this vacuum energy. We measure it, we calculate what it should be in particle physics. It's this enormous number that's 120 orders of magnitude. Currently, we're measuring a value of 0. This is a problem. And actually the paper is quite pessimistic in some sense, because he kind of says that like maybe this is a sort of unsolvable problem, but it's a brilliant paper. So then that's 1989. 1998, there's this observation of cosmic acceleration, and people realize immediately that another way of thinking about this is that this cosmic acceleration is driven by a cosmological constant. So then you think, oh, well, we've finally solved the problem that Weinberg articulates in the paper, except that the value of the cosmological constant that is required for cosmic acceleration is tiny. It's like tiny, tiny, tiny. So now we have a new problem, which is that it's very small, but not zero. But it is also still basically 120 orders of magnitude off from what we calculate in particle physics. So that's the kind of problem that will keep you up at night.
No, you know what? I'm listening to you talk, and I am just so excited to hear you think through the ideas that make you a physicist, because part of what I think is so beautiful about your work, and this gets to the question that I'm going to ask, but part of what I think is so beautiful about your work is your excitement around it and the way that you're able to explain it to people, right? People like me, the way that you're able to get those of us that have been historically told that this is not for us to understand what this is and to realize that this is something that we too are curious about, that we too love, right? And that brings me to your book, which is amazing and wonderful and beautiful and hot off the presses, and everybody needs to go out and get a copy, and everybody wants a copy, and so there you have it. But everyone that's on the call today, everyone that's on this webinar may not have had the opportunity to read it thus far, right? And so I want you to say a little bit about what is The Disordered Cosmos? What is this book about? And what is it that you're hoping to bring to your readers? What is it you're hoping to impart to your readers?
Should I start with what I thought I was doing or just where I ended up?
Ooh, both.
Yeah,
both. I love that, because that brings out the writer in you, right? Because those of us that are writers, there's the book that you thought you were writing, and then there's the book that you wrote, right? So tell us what you thought you were going to do, and then tell us what you think it's become.
Yeah, so I have to give like a lot of credit to my agent, Jessica Pappen, because first of all, Jessica has this amazing ability to convince like feminist, anti-racist writers to work with her. And part of it is because she's just such a good advocate. So Jessica contacted me and said, do you have representation? And I said, no, but also I don't want to write a memoir. So if that's what you want to discuss, we shouldn't even get on the phone. And Jessica is very smooth and said, no, let's talk anyway. So I got on the phone with her and I said, so what do you think that I could write? And she said, well, you have been blogging for several years. You've been writing about the problems of doing physics and astronomy. And it's being read by an audience that reads blogs. And it's primarily being read by like scientists who are very social media active, but it's not being read by other audiences that would get something from it. And I was like, oh man, Jessica thought of something I haven't. And I love talking to people who think of things that I haven't thought of. And so I was totally hooked. And so originally the idea was really that it was going to be an essay collection based on things that I had already written. And this was also a good sell for me because I was going into, I'm junior faculty, I'm an assistant professor. I knew I was going to be building a research group. So that's what I thought it was going to be. I thought the entire book was just going to be a critique. When I sat down to actually write the book, and that's primarily what I proposed to, and what my editor, Katie O'Donnell, who was amazing, I took on. When I actually sat down to write it, I realized, I have the subtitle is A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. And in some sense, the phrase dreams deferred is recursive because it's in fact a reference to the fact of the book and not just the things that the book is addressing. And I wanted to push back against that. I always thought coming from East Los, riding the school bus round trip 3 hours a day to my high school and back home to East Los again, because I went to high school in West LA. I always thought I was going to write my own version of A Brief History of Time. That was my dream, is that I wanted kids from East LA to have a brief history of time from East LA. I wanted kids from Brooklyn, which is where my both sides of my family are rooted, to have their version of A Brief History of Time. so I realized that that had to go into the book. Otherwise, I was actually participating in deferring my own dreams. So that was what happened as I was writing. The other piece that, and I think where I landed, was that I think one of the reasons that the book works, and I'm just going to start with the premise that the book works.
It does work. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. But one of the reasons that the book works is that by the time you get to the end where you're reading Black feminist physics at the end of the world, and you're reading My Dear Mama, My Letter to My Mother, you understand why this matters so much to me and to the people that I'm talking about, and why some of these questions that I'm raising about Black children and Indigenous children and all children having access to the night sky is important. And I think that if you don't get to see my excitement for and passion for physics, that message will be muted for you. So I think that that's part of it. And then the other piece is that I think that we as particle physicists and astronomers and cosmologists have to start making the case for our work in a way that goes beyond our traditional relationship with the military industrial complex. And this was my opportunity to make the case for how the science can coexist with a humanist way of looking at the world. So that's where I landed. I thought I was doing something much easier than what I ended up doing, I guess is another way of putting it. And I feel like, Josh, maybe you can relate to this, given that you're still in the middle of working on your book.
It's only been a decade, so yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can relate to this.
Oh my goodness. Is there a part of the book that is your favorite? And can you read a little bit of it for us?
Oh dear. Okay. Luckily I have the copy where I've marked things off. I have to say that like the introduction, I feel like is one of my strongest pieces of writing.
It's beautiful. I just want to say that and register that on the recording. It is, the introduction to your book is absolutely breathtaking.
Thank you. I also actually think that the ending, the letter to my mother, was maybe the most fun for me because I genuinely surprised my mother with it. So she did not know that, she knew I was working on a book. I'm not sure how much detail. My mom is like a super busy organizer, so she doesn't keep detailed track of everything I'm up to. And a week before I had, like, we were finalizing and going to the stage where things are paginated and you can't take things out because it'll mess up the entire process. I sent it to my mom and said, I've done this thing. You have 1 week to tell me to take it out. And she wrote back and had like one sentence she didn't want in there. And I took that out. But it was a wonderful thing to be able to surprise my mother and to say thank you to her in a very big way. And I'll say that for me, intellectually, this was a very important thing to do as someone who's now working in feminist studies and women's and gender studies, that I have noticed that people are interested in the organizing that my mom has done, for example, as co-founder of Black Women for Wages for Housework.
Right.
But often her name is missing from the conversation, that she is at best recognized as a bit player. And I felt like this was my opportunity to use my platform to say, this is Margaret Prescott, and you will pay attention to who Margaret Prescott is and what she has done in the world. And so it actually was me as a daughter, but also me as a scholar of Black feminist studies saying, this is someone that I want other scholars of Black feminist studies to pay attention to. And I would hope that I would have the intellectual wherewithal to see that significance, even if she was not my mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes in from, the way that Patricia Hill Collins articulates Black feminist thought, for example, that motherhood is a key core theme of Black feminist thought. And so in that sense, I'm also connecting with fundamental tenets of one of our most central works of literature in the field. Okay, now I'm really torn about which part to read. Kristen,
read it all. Just read it all.
I was about to say, a hint would be, no matter what you choose, we're going to love it. That's
okay. I'll choose a few paragraphs from each. Is that okay?
Okay, of course, whatever. This is
Okay.
your show, so go for it.
Okay. So the introduction is entitled, In the Beginning, a Bedtime Story. Once upon a time, there was a universe. We are not sure about how it started or whether there is a reason. We don't know, for example, if space-time is ordered or disordered at the smallest scales, which are dominated by the weirdness of quantum mechanics. We are pretty sure that during the first sliver of a trillionth of a second, it expanded very rapidly, so that for the most part, it looked the same in every direction and looked the same from every position. It was sameness everywhere. Except that particles started to blip out of nothing due to random fluctuations caused by quantum effects. Maybe in space-time, we are still not super sure about that. Then again, we are not super sure about this either. For some reason, those particles formed more matter than antimatter. That process, which formed a particle type called baryons, is called baryogenesis. From there, those baryons started to form structures, and from those structures, stars formed. Then the stars got old, and some of them died in super epic, rather fabulous fashion. They exploded into supernovae, making heavy elements like carbon and oxygen in the process. Those elements went on to be the basis for all life on Earth. Earth is a planet, one of the structures that formed around stars from the leftovers of supernovae. Eventually, a smaller type of structure that we call life formed on Earth. Some of the life forms that evolved were relatively hairless apes that use a variety of methods of communication. There are about 7 billion of these apes, with various levels of eumelanin and pheomelanin in their skin and hair, giving them a range of colors. The apes also have a lot of different hair textures. Some of the ones with less eumelanin have for a long time now been cruel to the ones with more, some of whom we know as, quote, Black people. We know why this is, although we don't fully understand the why, but it might be due to laziness or because they are jealous of our boogie. But despite this, Black lives come from the same baryogenesis, the same supernovae, and the same structure formation. No matter what the lowest eumelanin people say, Black lives are star stuff and Black lives matter, all of them. Okay, maybe I'll actually stop there and skip the end.
No, I think you should do whatever you want to do, but I was going to say to you, that part of the book just made me cry when I read it because of the way that you invoke children, of the way that you invoke Black children in particular, of the way that you invoke innocence, and at the same time remind us of how much we have let our prejudices over-determine our understandings of the universe and where we sit in the universe, right? But I'm going to pass it to Josh because I know I don't want to monopolize.
No, I'm enjoying the conversation. You guys, I'll just sit back if you want. It's fine, honestly. Okay, so then I'll take it a little bit lighter, I guess, maybe. I don't know. So I guess I want to know why you became a physicist. I think it has to do with the story. I think there's joy and awe that are part of that story. And I wonder if you could just share some of the reasons why you became a physicist. And maybe if you could tell us about some of the joy and awe you still experience as a physicist today.
Yeah, so I think that this starts with, thank you for that question. I think that this starts with, I really like times tables. It's really that simple. I think that I know people have heard other iterations of this origin story, but I'm really going to back up and say, and maybe actually it starts before that with, in my first grade class, there was a girl named Anna. I remember her name. This is like a very important story for me. And Anna had skipped kindergarten, so she was a year younger than all of us. And so she was known to be very smart. And Anna knew something called times tables. And I did not. And I was horrified by the idea of somebody knowing something that I did not. And so at that point, I was already living primarily with my mother. But the next time I saw my father, I insisted to him that he teach me times tables because it was unacceptable that someone should know this thing that I did not know. And I just fell in love. I loved the pattern. I loved the idea that there were these things that you wrote down on paper and there was a consistent pattern. And I think, you know, as a child, I really latched onto the stability of that. In a lot of ways, being the child, being a movement baby, as we're sometimes called, involves a lot of instabilities. Particularly, my family was spread out. I was getting moved between households. I was being sent off in the summers to be taken care of by other family members. There was a kind of stability in the patterns, right? Mm-hmm. So I became known for being very good in math. By the time I was 10 years old, I had, against the wishes of my parents, actually been categorized as highly gifted. And so like the teachers were always talking to my mom about, you know, what are the things that you can do to enrich? So when I was 10, my mom took me to see a documentary about Stephen Hawking called A Brief History of Time. It's a documentary by Errol Morris, who himself is an interesting figure in history of science discourse. I'll just drop that there for people to Google. Look for Errol Morris and Ashtray, and actually you'll get a very interesting book that maybe, yeah, really. And so I was 10, I didn't want to see this documentary. What 10-year-old thinks documentaries are cool? I mean, I'm sure there are some out there, but I was not one of them. I should say that my mom spent like gas money driving us from East LA to West LA to go see a matinee at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I think I also was probably like, I just want to watch X-Men cartoons right now, right? I was still a 10-year-old. And halfway through the documentary, Stephen Hawking was talking about using math to describe the universe, and using math in particular to try and figure out what happens at the center of a black hole. And that this was a problem that Einstein had not worked out. And I was like, hold up, I can get paid to do math. And that's like a whole job. And I can do things that Einstein couldn't figure out. And again, that's a whole ass job, right?
Right.
And I came out of the movie theater like, yeah, I want to do this. I came out harassing my mom. I think harassment is probably a good word. I share with her that kind of stubbornness. When I want something, I really want it. I'm asking her for a copy of the book, and she said, no, I don't want you to try and read it and, you know, not understand it and feel demoralized. And then her older brother, my Uncle Peter, bought it for my 11th birthday. And it took me like 5 years to read it.
Yeah.
But that's how I became a theoretical physicist. And I think, I mean, I will also say I wrote an email to Stephen Hawking the following year asking how to become a theoretical physicist.
At 11?
Yeah.
I'm just clarifying. Yeah.
Yes. I would say like one of the ways that I benefited from being the child of political organizers is that they were very early adopters of the internet as an organizing tool. So they were using email to save money on phone calls, because phone calls, especially international ones, were really expensive. Yeah. And it was also cheaper than using a fax machine for a lot of stuff. And so I had access to a computer, I had access to the internet. So I literally looked up Hawking's email address on the Cambridge University website. And by that point, I had been with my mother at the United Nations and the halls of Congress. And I think even by that point, to the White House, watching her lobby people. And so I knew if you wanted something, you went to the person who definitely had what you wanted and asked them for it.
So I love it. I love it. I hope all the students are on this call listening and taking notes, because that's exactly how you change things.
You go to the people who have the thing and you ask them for it very directly. And one of his graduate students wrote back and said, like, here's, you go to college, you go to graduate school, you become a professor. And I think to this day, the thing that continues to motivate me is still this fascination with math as a language that describes the universe. Like, I think at base, that is a pretty incredible connection that we can make these, using experiments on Earth and observations without even leaving the surface of the planet, that there is so much we've been able to put together. Or just going into low Earth orbit with the Hubble Space Telescope, for example, that we have a somewhat incomplete, but fairly filled in timeline of like 14 billion years of our universe's history. And that math has really been an incredible tool in getting us there. I'm still fascinated by that. I love that.
I really love that story for so many reasons. And I think one of the reasons is the way that it reminds us of how much care we should have with children and their dreams. Because, you know, part of the point of your book and part of the impetus behind your book is that you want Black children to be able to have the same dreams of science that other children have, right? And that is something that is rare. And to be able to have that vision, to be able to be introduced to those things so early in life, and to be able to have the family structure to have folks say, no, yeah, go send that email and ask him how you do.
Oh, I don't think anybody knew that I had sent the email.
Oh, wow.
I should say.
Okay.
I totally did that. Another thing about being a movement baby is you have a lot of independence, maybe sometimes too much, but I did that all by myself.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, but that in and of itself says a lot just about how you were raised and how much, you know, and how much Black feminism has a lot to do with who you are. Because I think when you're talking about your mom, right, and you're talking about your letter to your mom that you end the book with, a lot of people don't know if they know who you are from your social media presence, which is how I got to know who you are, then you don't immediately know all the layers of your life, right? But there are many, many layers, and your radical roots go deep and are long. And so one of the things that I was hoping that you could talk about is how you became a Black feminist, right? And particularly that radical history of your family, and you know what it is it brings. What does your Black feminism bring to your identity as a physicist?
Again, I have to go back to my mom, first of all, right? Because as my primary caregiver throughout my childhood, I think I've worn her down. So at this point, maybe she wouldn't be like, if I said my mom's a Black feminist thinker, she's definitely a Black feminist thinker, a Black feminist organizer. And so I was surrounded by that. And as I just gave an example of how I took the lessons that I in terms of the tools and applied them maybe in a way she wasn't really expecting, right? I think like critically picking up Black feminist thought as a lens through which you see the world is not something that has to happen solely through having contact with Black women, right? And so another very influential figure for me was my grandmother, Selma James, who in the early 1970s founded the Wages for Housework campaign. And around that time, I guess a little bit before, she wrote this pamphlet, Sex, Race, and Class, which people can find online. My mom got involved in Wages for Housework and ultimately co-founded Black Women for Wages for Housework because she read Sex, Race, and Class. And one of my favorite stories about this is that she read it and was like, wow, this Black woman is so incredible. And my mom like could not believe it when it turned out that Selma was a white Jewish woman. And part of it is actually, if you go back and read Sex, Race, and Class, it along with other items of feminist thought at that time period, primarily from Black women, articulates something that we might now label as intersectionality. And this is actually something that I quote in the book. It's the epigraph at the start of Wages for Scientific Housework chapter, which is, it's very much rooted in my family. So I spent many summers essentially like purposefully, I think my family thought about this, getting a feminist education and getting a political education is maybe the way that we say it. From Selma, that this was something that my family thought about very intentionally. And then I also want to mention my stepmother, Maria Elva Maldonado, who's actually a UT Austin alum, and was one of the first Chicanas to go to law school at Georgetown University Law Center, and subsequently went and worked with the farm workers in California and worked with Cesar Chavez. that I was surrounded in a lot of ways, not just by Black feminism, but I think by women of color feminism and, you know, transnational thought beyond US borders. And I think that all of those things primed me that when I started to look around and see problems in physics, that is the framework I went to for how do I analyze what I'm seeing and what is happening around me.
So I'm just going to do a quick follow-up, and then I promise you I'm going to send it to Josh. But really quickly, you mentioned that then framed how you started to see things in physics. And one of the great contributions that you have in this book is your discussion of Black feminist physics. And so I wanted to see if you could just tell us a little bit about what that is in your conception, and what you're hoping to bring with that unexpected fusion, right, between these two disciplinary spaces.
I really want to punt this by saying that I'm actually working on a chapter for the Rutledge Handbook on intersectionality right now. That's due in about a month, so I'm working on it.
No one call in pressure. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Where I'm spending a lot of time, people who follow me on Twitter might have seen this morning that I was looking at both the first and second edition of Patricia Hill Collins's Black Feminist Thought and doing some cross comparisons of even how that book changed over the course of about a decade. And even reading her discussion, but even I encourage people to look at the table of contents of both, and there's like just a whole story of just comparing those two that I'm really thinking about. What are the features of Black feminist thought that can be brought into physics productively in a way that helps us rethink power relations in physics and ethics in physics? I am someone who is by nature particularly interested in how we think about knowledge and knowledge production. So for the formalists in the audience, I'm an epistemologist. And so I'm particularly focused on her chapter, which is not in the first edition, but in the second one, on Black feminist epistemology. What are the different ways that Black feminist thought teaches us to think about what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes data, what constitutes...
Josh found a passage from the book. He's going to read it while you're getting rebooted.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I would just read from the very end of your book because you had talked about the letter to your mother. And so I thought I would just read the beginning of that. To the one and only Margaret Prescott, I feel most at home scientifically with a Lagrangian. I know I will never be able to explain to you what a Lagrangian is. Oh, there you are.
No, keep going, Josh.
Keep going? Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
Your mother's an idiot when it comes to math, you always say. But the Lagrangian is an equation that is tied to the most fundamental properties of a physical system. There are rules for how to extract information from a Lagrangian. What is the system's future? What is its past? I can gather these pieces of information by calculating the equations of motion from the Lagrangian. These tell us how the system evolves. I can also calculate the energy in a system. This is a Hamiltonian. Technically, the Hamiltonian framework is an equivalent one to the Lagrangian, but I don't feel as at home with it. Should I keep going? Are you there, Chanda? I don't want to embarrass
I'm here. Can everyone hear me?
Pros anymore.
Yeah,
yes, we can hear
here.
you. It seems like your internet is getting back settled into the universe.
Yeah, so basically our modem and then router had to reboot because the electricity to the entire house went down.
That's okay. We understand.
Maybe I'll just follow up on the last question a little bit and a little bit of your answer. So much of who you are adds to your physics. And I want to talk about what has been subtracted from physics in the past and what is subtracted now from physics. In particular, physics misses a lot because it is so white, so male, so heteronormative. And I wonder if you could maybe talk about just a little bit, like what do we miss in physics that, because we do not have queer, Latinx, indigenous, all Black voices adding to the chorus that is physics? What do we get when we have those voices too in physics?
Yeah, I want to be careful in answering this question, right? Because there is a real risk of re-articulating people from marginalized groups as resources, which is unfortunately in the Enlightenment framework, actually like a very normative way of framing why the global majority matters. Is what kinds of labor can they provide? What kinds of ideas can they provide? And at the same time, yes. So I just said I'm an epistemologist. I'm interested in knowledge. It's very clear that, say, when a Black woman gets her PhD, or say her ends up for whatever reason leaving a program with a terminal master's because the department she was in was discouraging to her, was not ready to support her, that there are lines of thought that she probably takes with her. And there are ways that you can trace this, even if you're like, well, we don't know exactly what she would have thought of in the future. The one thing that you can say is that the research that we do in academia, the way that academia is structured, is that you are the advocate for your work. So if you want your work to be cited, you have to go out and give talks about it. You have to cite it yourself. You have to remind people that your work is out there. And if people are not proactively in a position to do that for themselves because they are no longer part of the physics community, then that does shape what kind of knowledge is being produced, because it shapes the environment in which people are making decisions about what information we know, what information we need to know. And I just want to point to Kristen's work with the Cite Black Women Collective as one of the ways that maybe we challenge this a little bit, which is that if we as a community are all making a decision to proactively cite Black women, then the onus is far less on individual Black women to advocate for our work. And the collective's work has really inspired my own, in that I actually have a grant. I'm going to be spending part of the weekend this weekend reading applications for a research assistant for a Cite Black Women Plus in physics project, where I will be building with the support of a research assistant, a public bibliography of papers by Black women and gender minorities who have PhDs in physics. So that way, when people are thinking about, okay, I'm working on this topic, you can proactively say to yourself, has a Black woman written on this topic? Is there a way that I can connect my work with what she does? I'll say that's an epistemic decision with epistemic outcomes. It changes the direction that knowledge goes in. So I think that there are ways that we can move around that. That said, I don't want people to think of the accessibility of a bibliography like this to allow them to do Blackness without Black people, which is, I'm citing Black women. I don't need to collaborate with Black women. I don't need to support Black women because I did support them by citing one time, right? So I think, when we talk about what is lost to physics, and I'll also highlight Sandra Harding's work on strong objectivity, that she argues that diversity is actually essential for maximizing our capacity for objectivity and knowledge production. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I agree that that's true. But what if it wasn't? Human rights are still actually a fundamental piece of the conversation, which is that Black children should have access to the resources that white children have access to because they are children. And they are not a different species, they are children. And so the question, in some sense, that I ask throughout the book is, how do we allow Black children to have childhoods? That's part of, how do we allow poor children to have childhoods? How do we allow Indigenous children to have childhoods? And in relation to this, I just want to make a point. There's a part of the book that's taken from a speech that I gave at Occidental College in 2018, which was the first time. So for people who don't know, Occidental College is in East LA. Mm-hmm. It's in Northeast LA. It's in Eagle Rock, which is my best friend Sharifa, who drew the figures for the book. That's where she grew up. And so it's my old stomping grounds. It's gentrified a lot. And I was thinking a lot about what it meant to go and talk about physics, to go home and find that the community I came from is actually no longer there.
Mm.
And I was also thinking about the fact that children were in cages, and that the community that is traditionally part of East LA, primarily Mexican American, primarily Central American, primarily Central American and Mexican immigrant, was being erased from the neighborhood as the people who might populate it were being kept in cages. So I think it's important also when we're talking about letting children have a childhood, that we ask the question of how do we make it so that children are not spending part of their childhood walking hundreds of miles away from violence and finding themselves walking into violence. And how do we create the circumstances that ensure that when children have the opportunity to spend time under the night sky, under a dark night sky, it's because they're getting to sit there and wonder about the universe, and not because they are literally running for their lives, right? So when I think about like what is lost to science, like yes, things are lost to science, but what is lost to us as human beings when we allow whole swaths of humanity to be erased like this? I think for me, that ends up being the framing question.
Thank you, yeah.
No,
yeah.
You know, as I listen to you talk, I can't help but think of the killing of Dante Wright and Adam Toledo, that is just devastating our community right now, and the ways that, you know, your book and your work speaks to the vacuum around Black futurity in our everyday lives, right? The fact that Black folk are getting killed by the police on a regular basis means that Black children don't get a chance to imagine the night sky. And so there's a way that any conversation about diversity and inclusion in the natural sciences, in the academy, in universities, in physics, in any discipline, can't sidestep the necessity of preserving Black life. Because in order for us to have these visions, we have to have Black life to be able to engage with, right?
Yeah, I'll say that, you know, I get asked to give a lot of talks on diversity and inclusion, and I used to give a lot more of them than I do now. When I do give them, it's usually a talk that's titled "The Problem with Diversity and Inclusion." And the first slide in the talk is, what does it do for Jacob Blake's children? Yes. Who witnessed their father being shot in the back, and now the police officer who did it is back at work as of this week. That's the news of this week. Or what does it do for Tamir Rice, who was a child who was murdered by the police while playing in the park? And the point is that diversity and inclusion discourse doesn't do anything to stop these children from either being traumatized or murdered. And so if you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you have not gone far enough to address the problems that need to be addressed if we're really serious about what it means to be Black in physics or anywhere else, whether you're Black in physics or you know, you're Black and driving a new car, whether you're sleeping like Breonna Taylor, you can't even sleep safely, right? I always think of Ayanna Stanley Jones as the first major Black while sleeping. She was 7, I believe. Seven. She was 7. Yeah. She was 7 years old and shot while sleeping on, I think it was her grandmother's couch.
Yes.
Shot
by the police, for those that don't know.
Yeah, shot by the police. Right. I think like also the story that people want to tell themselves is like Black on Black violence, but that's not what happened, right? I was part of a group called Particles for Justice that last year called for a strike for Black lives on June 10th. And we did this in tandem with a group of astronomers that called for shut down academia, shut down STEM. So if you participated in any of those activities, that was us. And if you go to the Particles for Justice website, it's just like particlesforjustice.org or .com. I think we own both of them. You'll see that we made a very clear call for people to take to take action that would change the material circumstances under which Black people live and work, in recognition that Black scientists live in the larger Black community, and what happens to the larger Black community affects Black scientists. So I know we have to move on, but the final comment I want to make about that is that it is very easy to point to someone like me and say, but the system works because you get through the door. But representation is not structural change for my community. Throughout the last several years, ICE has been kidnapping people off the street in the community where I grew up, and me having a Harvard degree did not stop that. I also want to point out the fact that as the first Black woman to have a tenure track faculty position in either particle theory or cosmology theory, I'm light-skinned. And I know that there are times when I have been more easily received by people who maybe don't see me as human in exactly the same way that they would see a white person as human, but they don't dehumanize me as much. And so I want people to be really careful about pointing to exceptions and making what we would consider to be a massive scientific interpretive error and saying that the one exceptional data point represents any kind of transformative pattern. And I think that just to go back to what's happened this week, I just read a few hours ago that a South African man was killed by the Hawaiian police. And I apologize for not knowing his name, but I want to ask people to look for his name as well.
No, I think, I think that what is so important about your interventions just now is in part because here in spaces of the university, they see faces like yours, they see faces like mine, and they think that they've done enough. And we have not done enough. And we can do more. And we need to hold ourselves accountable to doing more. I know we're up against time, and I want us to get to the Q&A, but I want to close with one thing that is very near and dear to your heart. And I also want to read a quick quote, because I think that the conversation that we just had can be best summed up in your quote from page 8 of your book, where you say, I have 2 big dreams for Black children and others, besides clean water, good food, access to healthcare, and a world without mass incarceration. 1, to know and experience Blackness as beauty and power. And 2, to know and experience curiosity about the night sky, to know it belonged to their ancestors. And that to me is one of those quotes that is just beautiful, and also goes to the piece of artwork that is near and dear to your heart. And I think for those of us that are writers, and it's right behind you, exactly, but for those who can't see, right behind Chanda Prescott-Weinstein right now, you can see here on your screen, for many of us who are writers, to end is to begin is to end. And you begin your book with this image as a sketch. And it's very, very important to you. It's by Shaniqua Gay, an artist named Shaniqua Gay. You commissioned it, and you have named it We Were Always Scientists. And I wanted you to just close this portion of the day before we get to questions by talking a little bit about this image and what it means to you.
The idea behind the commission was that I wanted to understand myself as not necessarily new to the scientific conversation, but only new to what we call professionalized science. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't mind keeping the painting up, maybe I'll make some points
about the features.
Sorry. Yeah. And so specifically, I asked Shaniqua to do a painting that represented enslaved Black women as scientists, unnamed enslaved Black women as scientists. I think many of us have heard of Benjamin Banneker, and that's basically the only Black scientists that we ever really hear about from that era. So Shaniqua asked me to send her some images that were related to my work. And I sent her some of my favorite gravitational lensing images. And I sent her the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. And so what you can see in the painting, if you look closely, in the center of the painting, you can see the arcing of a gravitational lens where space-time is so distorted by either the presence of a galaxy cluster, or I guess the presence of a galaxy cluster with lots of dark matter in it, that space-time has bent and is acting like a funhouse mirror. And so I encourage people to Google gravitational lens and actually look at these images. You'll see that there are galaxies. That's basically the only guidance I gave Shaniqua, and she came back with the sketch that appears at the beginning of the book. And I will also say that I could not afford to pay Shaniqua very much, and this painting is about three times the size of what we agreed on. So Shaniqua was incredibly generous. She also asked me what my favorite material was, and I said wood because my grandfather was a factory worker who also liked to work with wood, and so it's on wood.
Oh, wow.
The one interesting thing that I'll say is the woman in the blue hat. When I started doing the book tour for this about a month ago, my aunt and my mother saw the painting close up for the first time. And both emailed and said, this looks just like your great grandmother. And I hadn't sent Shaniqua any images of my family. And when they say this looks just like your great grandmother, they said that this was the way that she dressed even. And for context, my mother was born in a chattel house in Barbados. So that's the painting. And I will tell you all that the most contentious thing was Shaniqua and I had a long discussion about the vegetables on the table and what the women might be up to. So I am a little bit of an herbalist by hobby. And so I know about tomatoes and the deadly nightshade family. And so we decided that maybe they were trying to figure out exactly how much tomato leaf extract they needed to create some poison. Maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they're just curious about creating, tomato leaf extract, or, maybe, they could be doing something else. They could be making a green curry. Who knows what they are up to? But I want to encourage people to check out Shaniqua's work. And yeah, so I think hopefully Kristen's getting some water.
Did we lose Kristen? I think we lost Kristen. I mean, it's a gorgeous painting, and it's the perfect frontispiece and just the perfect way to start the book. It's amazing. I was thinking it's probably time for us to go to some questions, and maybe I'll ask one question that was submitted beforehand by a student. This one is by Joseph Guidry, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was an undergrad in the College of Natural Sciences, who asked, basically, something I think many physicists in particular have failed to realize is that incorporating both Indigenous and Black feminist epistemologies into the physics classroom is not only possible, but it's extremely powerful and necessary. Can you speak on how you have done so in your own classroom and how you've observed others who do so?
I thought this was a very interesting question. So I got this question ahead of time, and I thought that this was very interesting because this is actually a hard thing, particularly for me as a Black woman who is untenured, that and in our current media environment, that there's actually some very serious personal risk. And I don't just mean professionally, but to my own safety as someone who receives death threats, to doing things that diverge too much from what is considered standard curricular activity. So that said, I think part of what's interesting here is that there is Black women's history, for example, there is Indigenous history, and there's Black history, and then there is actually Black feminist praxis. which is how do we think about what we know and how do we approach knowledge production? And that's not necessarily about talking about Blackness, for example. That is sometimes about encouraging people to see themselves as part of the conversation. And so that might even come down to what kinds of problems do you put on the problem set? So when I taught Intro to Astrophysics a couple of falls ago, occasionally I would give the students a problem that was open-ended that involved asking them to go and look at a plot and tell me what they saw on it. And that gets out of the framing of the textbook has all of the answers and your standpoint is not important, that I'm actually saying your standpoint and looking at these plots is important. Even if, you know, your textbook has some discussion about what you should see, I want you to see it for yourself. And if you look at Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought, and particularly the discussion of Black feminist epistemology, one of the key features of Black feminist epistemologies is that Black feminists expect people to have direct experience with the thing that they are talking about. And so it is actually a Black feminist practice to ask students to go out and get firsthand experience with doing that analysis. It is also the case that, you know, when I make decisions about anecdotes along the way, that I may drop anecdotes that are unusual. I think that, you know, when I'm talking about how we observe spectra, that I mention Elmer Imes, who I discuss in the book. He was the second African-American to earn a PhD in physics, and his experimental work played a key role in convincing people that there truly was something to the theory of quantum mechanics. That's not something that's known. Elmer Imes is also really important in the history of Black physicists because he founded the Fisk University Physics Department, which I think we could trace an inordinate number of Black people in physics somehow were influenced by someone who went through the Fisk University Physics Department. So there are a lot of ways to bring it in, but I do hope that students understand that in an environment where professors are being recorded and where professors are being targeted, that this seems like it's something that's very easy to do, but also that our lives are physically on the line. And this is a conversation that I'm constantly having with my department chair, even about the size of the classes that I can teach, because I need to be able to know that someone's supposed to be in the room. So that's also a Black feminist practice, which is keeping myself safe. I see a question here that I want to answer.
Yeah, there's. Do you go for it? I think I know which one you're gonna answer. So go for it. Yes, please.
So I would like to answer Julian's question. So Julian says, I am a Black third-year physics student here at UT, and I'm currently struggling with imposter syndrome and doubts about my career path. What would be your advice in dealing with this? And if you have ever felt this way, how did you get through this? So the easy answer here is that I actually have a whole chapter in the book where I talk about this exact phenomenon called Let Astrophysics Be the Dream It Used to Be. It's a rewrite of a version that you can find online, but I would say that the chapter version is better because our iterations are always better.
Because writing, right.
because writing.
Yes.
And I had, you know, I wrote the original version of that in a very particular headspace. And I wrote it like in the course of 2 hours and then hit publish, which I think a lot of people don't know. That was like a 2 hour, I wrote it, I hit publish.
I can't believe it. It's amazing.
Yeah. I used to do that a lot. I do that less now. Less. I still do it sometimes. I want to make a comment about imposter syndrome and the prevalence of discussions about imposter syndrome, which is if you are feeling like the world was not built for you as a Black person, that's correct. You're not, there's nothing wrong with you. And I really want to be clear with people about this because I think people can start to gaslight themselves like, oh, I am thinking wrongly about myself because you are correctly recognizing that the world was not built for you and that your professors are maybe inadequately prepared to support you. Because let me be real with you. Even if the department requires a diversity statement as part of hiring, there's no way that their competency with Black students was even like a 10% consideration in the hiring process. It might have been a 5% consideration, but generally speaking, it's not a consideration. This world was not built for you. That doesn't mean you are an imposter, but I think recognizing that you are an outsider is like, that's correct. And that's a sign that your analytic capabilities are very much on point. So I want to reverse that and say, you can see the world and you are good at collecting data. Alice Walker in Search of Our Mother's Gardens talks about the loneliness that comes with that perspective. And so I would encourage you to pick that up. I will say for me personally, a driving thing was, I can't leave this just to white people. It's not fair. The night sky belongs to all of us. And that was actually a conversation I had with myself. When I got low grades, I worked to improve them. I got low grades. So let's just say, like, I got low grades. The most important quality that a scientist can have is persistence. It's not genius. Yeah. Even if your brain works faster than others, that will only get you so far. And it won't get you far enough. Einstein spent 10 years between special relativity and general relativity. And we like to talk about him like he did that by himself, but he had a whole team of mathematicians that he was in conversation with and whose work he was drawing on, sometimes mathematical work that was decades old at that point. So I just want to tell you to keep going. And whatever the thing that excited you about physics was, hang on to that because it does belong to you. It is yours.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that answer. That was the exact question that I was going to push to you. So I'm glad that you went to it. We have some pre-submitted questions too. I don't know, we're kind of toggling between the two, but there are two that I thought we could synthesize if that's okay. There's a question from an undergraduate named Maya Malia, from College of Liberal Arts, and they say there's a common perception that science is supposed to be objective. So racism, sexism, bias, et cetera, do not exist in scientific research nor results. What is your usual response to people who do not understand that science does not exist in a bubble? It can be twisted for various agendas, and STEM fields carry a systematically discriminatory legacy. And I want to piggyback that question on one from Christine Williams, who's a faculty member in the College of Liberal Arts, who wanted to know about your science article and your idea and the way that you talk about strong objectivity as an answer to the problem of misogynoir in physics. And I think those two go together nicely, I think. And so I was hoping that you could answer them kind of in tandem.
I think my favorite example of how social phenomena can really mess up outcomes in physics is the recent realization that we had misunderstood how sperm and eggs interact, because they were like, yes, the sperm's really masculine and the egg's like a finding little woman, right? And then it was like, oh, actually, we totally screwed up like the motor mechanisms for that because we were too busy gendering things to actually look at like what was actually happening. So I think that's a really fun example to bring up. It's also something like you can Google it, there are articles about it. You can like email people and say, here's a really great example of when you don't take into account that men have traditionally been socialized to, and I really do think this is a socialization. Nobody's chromosomes make them do this, right? That cis men in particular have traditionally been socialized to project their sense of self onto their subject, onto like whatever they're studying, that it can really mess things up. I think that's a really good example. I will say that in feminist philosophy of science, that there has been this habit of articulating physics as an epistemic exception. Like, yes, it happens in the life sciences, it doesn't happen so much in physics. So I wrote a paper entitled Making Black Women Scientists Under White Empiricism, where I argue that actually physicists have a tendency to keep and throw out data based on the identity of the person producing that data and the ideas associated with it. and that this is shaped by white supremacy, which I will say, when I say white supremacy, I mean all of the systems that work together in that: ableism, patriarchy, hetero cis sexism. And in the paper, I suggest that maybe Sandra Harding's idea of strong objectivity is one way of responding to this phenomenon. I don't come down strongly on that. And I kind of leave that open for, I'm working on a second book called Scientists versus Science, which will be a peer-reviewed book. And this is something I actually plan to unpack a little bit. As I said earlier, I have concerns about arguing that diversity is good for science, turning us into resources. And I do think that strong objectivity veers too much in the direction of making that case. But I do think that she's right that there are different sciences. One of the important things she says in the Strong Objectivity book is she talks about disunity of science, that actually the scientific method in biology looks completely different from the scientific method in physics. And in fact, the scientific method in theoretical physics looks nothing like the scientific method in experimental physics. In that, I think now, and I wouldn't have argued this when I wrote the white empiricism paper, theoretical physicists are at least part-time rationalists and are not empiricists. And that has to be articulated in some clear sense. So those, I would say those are things that I'm still working through right now. And that's okay.
Thank you so much for that. I think that, you know, it's something that's on everybody's mind. And I think that we've been inculcated with this idea that there's objectivity and all these other kinds of things. And your example of the sperm and the egg is brilliant, obviously. And I think that really sums things up. But it also reminds me that when you're talking about imposter syndrome and you're talking about the ways that physics has been exclusionary, and just, you know, academic disciplines generally, we're also talking about gender and sexuality, right? And I think that we've talked less about that today, but it's something that is pervasive in everything that you do and very much a part of your work. And I just want to say that out loud, because one of the take homes that I took home from the book is that the universe is queer. And that to me was just a beautiful intervention, right? Because the universe is queer. Right? Which reminds us that any attempts to put on kind of a white, masculinist, patriarchal, imperialist lens on science or read it through that perspective tries to discipline something that insists on being undisciplined. Right? And so I just wanted to kind of say that. I know we're at the end of time, but is there anything that you want to say to close, or any questions that were unanswered that you would like to answer?
Yeah, just in response to like, what can we do besides engage in D&I that Emily May posted, I would really encourage people to go to the Particles for Justice website and have a look at some of the suggested actions that we said people could take on the day of the strike for Black lives. Every day is a great day to engage in any of those activities. Take action to change the material circumstances under which people live. And I promise Black people will show up in physics and astronomy because we want to be here. It is the conditions that we are in that shift our ability to be here. So I think that that's a really important thing. And just to go back to Julian's question, I also want to say that contrary to what we have been told about genius and fixed intelligence, please have a flexible intelligence mindset. Your brain is capable of rational thought. And so your task is to figure out how to organize that process for yourself so that you can input new information and learn new skills, because that's all you are being asked to do. You're not being asked to conjure magic.
Dr. Prescott-Weinstein, I could talk to you all day, all night, easily.
Can we keep going a little bit? No.
I know, right? Can we just keep, can we just keep you forever?
I'll just listen. I'll just listen in. Just keep talking. That's all we need.
But we are up at the end of our time, and we want to be respectful of your time and just say again, thank you so much for joining us here at the University of Texas today. We are just in awe of your brilliance and your contributions. We will follow up with everyone who registered with some of the resources that you mentioned in your talk today to make sure that people have access to those. I also want to make sure that everyone knows that this is part as well, in addition to a collaboration with the College of Natural Sciences, this is also part of our Feminist Futures, Feminist Past Symposium through the Center for Women's and Gender Studies. And we will be continuing these conversations around feminism's past, future, present next week on next Friday at the same time with a panel on the body. And so you can get more information through our website and we will send those links out. Again, thank you so much for coming. Josh, do you want to say some closing words?
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And your book is absolutely brilliant. And if you haven't yet, please go out and buy 3 copies. I think 3 is the minimum number that you're allowed to buy. So buy 3 copies, maybe give 2 away, put one on your mantle, wherever it is that you have your pride of place. That's where I want it.
Absolutely. And before I forget, I want to say a special thank you to Heather Lay, Melissa Taylor, and Nancy Ewart for putting this together, for making it all work, for making sure we all can be heard and seen, and that we're not doing anything that we're not supposed to do with the technology. We just appreciate you deeply, deeply, deeply. Thank you. Thank you, College of Liberal Arts. Thank you, College of Natural Sciences. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.